The kitchen smelled like fresh coffee and buttered toast, the kind of warmth that made a house feel like a home. I reached for the top shelf, stretching on my toes, fingertips barely grazing the edge of the glass jar. Before I could step onto a stool, I felt movement behind me, a presence solid and close. Then hands, firm and steady, reached past me, grabbing the jar effortlessly. My breath caught. He was too close. Close enough that I could feel the heat of his body, the subtle scent of his cologne mixing with the coffee in the air. I didn't move. Neither did he. A second stretched too long. An unspoken moment, thick and heavy. I exhaled sharply and stepped back just as he lowered the jar onto the counter. "Here," he said, voice even unreadable. I forced a smile, pushing down the strange, unfamiliar pull in my stomach. "Thanks," I muttered, turning away too quickly. Then footsteps. The sound of heels clicking against the tile. My sister walked in, tossing her keys onto the counter, oblivious. She greeted him with a kiss on the cheek, then glanced at me, her expression light, carefree. She saw nothing, felt nothing. But I did. And for the first time I wondered if I was imagining it, or if something had already begun. It started subtly, almost imperceptibly, like a song playing just low enough to make you question if you were really hearing it. He was around more, lingering in doorways, finding reasons to be near me. His words carried a warmth they hadn't before. Small things, innocent on the surface, but laced with something unspoken. "You always take your coffee black?" he asked one morning, watching as I poured a cup. I nodded, feeling his eyes on me, the weight of his attention heavier than it should have been. Even when my sister was there, I felt it. At dinner, his gaze would find me across the table, brief but deliberate. If I looked up, he wouldn't look away immediately. He held it for just a second too long. It made my skin prickle, my breath hitch in ways I didn't understand. Then the car ride. Just a quick trip to grab groceries, nothing unusual. But as we sat in silence, the weight between us thickened. No music, no small talk, just the sound of our breathing. I gripped the wheel tighter. He exhaled slowly. "You're quiet today." I forced a laugh. "Just tired." "Why?" The night air was warm, the distant hum of crickets filling the silence between us. I hadn't meant to step outside, but the house felt suffocating and the cool breeze was a relief. I didn't expect him to follow. "Couldn't sleep?" His voice was quiet, low. I shook my head, eyes fixed on the darkened street. "Just needed some air." He leaned against the railing, too close, but I didn't move. The conversation was easy at first. Memories, harmless jokes, words meant to fill space. But then something shifted. The way he looked at me, the way his voice dropped just slightly, the way the night suddenly felt smaller. My pulse quickened. His fingers brushed mine on the railing and I should have pulled away, but I didn't. He exhaled, something unspoken flickering in his eyes. Then it happened, brief, hesitant, a mistake in the making. His lips met mine just for a second, but the fire it ignited burned through me. We broke apart instantly, breathing heavy, reality crashing in. I stepped back, shaking my head, but the damage was done. I wouldn't forget. I told myself it was nothing. A mistake. A lapse in judgment fueled by the quiet of the night and the space between us shrinking too fast. I convinced myself that if I acted like it didn't happen, it would disappear. So I avoided him. I left rooms when he entered, kept conversations brief, refused to meet his gaze. But he noticed. He didn't say anything, didn't push, didn't question, but he watched. Not like before. Now it wasn't just glances. It was waiting. Waiting to see if I'd look first, if I'd acknowledge what we'd done. He was careful around my sister, effortless in pretending. But I felt the difference. His presence in the house was heavier now, his voice too measured, his laughter just a little too natural. He was performing. And I hated that I understood it. Then there was the neighbor. She caught me in the driveway, eyes sharp, unreadable. "Something feels different around here," she mused, voice light but laced with something else. I forced a laugh, shrugged. "Just busy lately." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. She knew something. I felt exposed. It was late again, the house quiet except for the faint hum of the fridge. My sister had gone to bed early, exhausted from work, leaving us alone in the dimly lit kitchen. I hadn't planned to be there. I just wanted water. But then he walked in, stretching, leaning against the counter like it was the most natural thing in the world. "Long day?" he asked casually, but his voice was too smooth, too controlled. I nodded, not looking at him, focusing on the glass in my hands. "I hate this," he said suddenly, and my stomach dropped. He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. You acting like I don't exist. My grip tightened on the glass. I have to, I whispered. He stepped closer, the space between us vanishing. No, you don't. His lips met mine, slower this time, deliberate. A decision, not a mistake. Heat rushed through me, but panic followed. I pulled back fast, breathless. We can't. He didn't argue, just studied me, jaw tight. The tension didn't fade. If anything, it grew, wrapping around us, impossible to ignore. Dinner felt different. My sister sat across from me, chatting about her day, but her energy was off. Eyes flickering toward her husband more than usual, lips pressing together between sentences. He was quiet too, more reserved than usual, responding just enough to seem normal. I forced myself to eat, to act natural, but every nerve in my body was on high alert. Then she asked it. You've been distracted lately, she said, tilting her head at him, voice casual but sharp underneath. He barely glanced up. Work's been stressful. It was a lie. I knew it. She knew it. I clenched my fork, not trusting myself to speak. Then she turned to me. And you? You've been quiet too. I swallowed hard, forced a smile. Just tired. Another lie. Then it happened. Under the table, unseen but undeniable. His fingers brushed mine, light but intentional, sending a jolt through me. I froze. He didn't move. My sister kept talking, oblivious. But my pulse pounded in my ears and something dark curled in my stomach, because for the first time I realized it. I was jealous of her. I tried to stay away. I stopped lingering in the kitchen, made excuses to leave the room when he entered, avoided being alone in the house. But it didn't matter. He was everywhere. If I left the room, he followed minutes later. If I avoided his gaze, he found ways to pull it back. He didn't say anything outright, but his presence was louder now, impossible to ignore. The neighbor noticed first. I felt her eyes on me as we stood in the driveway, her smile too knowing, her words too deliberate. You two used to talk more, she mused, nodding toward the house. Everything okay? My stomach tightened. Of course, I said too quickly, and she just hummed like she didn't believe me. Then the party. Too many people, too much noise, but it didn't matter because at some point it was just us. A dark hallway, a second too long spent in each other's orbit. I turned to leave, but he caught my wrist, his grip gentle but firm. You're not going to run forever, he said, voice low. And the worst part? I didn't want to. She had just returned from an intense workout, her muscles sore and her mind foggy from exhaustion. Desperate for relief, she stepped into the steaming shower, letting the hot water massage her aching body. The pressure of the stream pounded against her sore spots, and she instinctively adjusted the settings. Go harder and deeper inside, she muttered under her breath, twisting the nozzle to increase the intensity. The powerful jets hit just the right spots, easing the tension from her muscles. Lost in the soothing sensation, she didn't hear the bathroom door creak open. Her sister's husband had mistakenly walked in, expecting the room to be empty. His shocked expression met hers through the fogged-up glass, both frozen in an awkward moment of disbelief. He quickly averted his gaze, stammering an apology before backing out, shutting the door behind him. She stood there, heart racing, letting the water wash over her as the reality of the bizarre moment set in. But it didn't end there. Later that night, when the house was quiet, when she should have been sleeping, she found herself in his office. He was waiting as if he knew she'd come. Words didn't matter. The air between them crackled, the pull undeniable. She barely breathed as he stepped closer, his hand grazing her arm. Then the sound of footsteps. The door swung open. Her sister stood there, silent, eyes darting between them. A second stretched into eternity. He opened his mouth, reaching for an excuse, but nothing could fix this. It was already too late. The silence in the room was deafening. Her sister stood there, tears streaming down her face, her hands trembling as she pointed to the door. Get out, she whispered, voice breaking. Both of you. The words were sharp, each one cutting deeper than any physical blow could. Her husband, his face pale with regret, opened his mouth to speak, to offer an explanation, but the words never came. It didn't matter anymore. The damage was done. The trust shattered beyond repair. The neighbor stood by the door, her expression a mix of shock and disbelief, her wide eyes never leaving the scene unfolding in front of her. She wanted to speak, to say something comforting, but there was nothing to say. Outside, the sound of children crying pierced the heavy air, their innocent confusion cutting through the tension. They couldn't understand what had just torn their world apart. And neither could she. The guilt weighed on her, suffocating. She had destroyed everything: her sister's trust, her family, her own peace of mind. Alone in the empty house, she felt it. She had no one left. Not anymore. She gathered her things in silence, each movement heavy with the weight of finality. Clothes thrown into a bag, her heart growing colder with every step she took away from the life she had once known. The house felt hollow now, devoid of the warmth it used to have, empty like a shell. Her sister hadn't spoken to her in hours, every word of anger and betrayal still echoing in her mind. She couldn't even look at her anymore, the disappointment too much to bear. The silence between them was deafening. The man who had once been a husband, a partner, now stood in the hallway, his hands trembling as he reached out, desperate to fix what could never be fixed. He said he was sorry, that he'd do anything to make it right, but the words were empty. It was too late. The family was broken beyond repair, torn apart by the very people who should have been closest. Outside, she stepped into the cold night air, the weight of her actions settling in. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear: there was no going back. He would never fix this. Not now. Not ever.